My first night at Riverside Manor Care Home started like any other job orientation. Tanya, the head nurse, walked me through the building just as the sun was setting, casting long shadows through the Victorian windows. The manor itself was impressive, a 3-story brick building that had been converted into a care facility in the 1980s, with high ceilings and ornate woodwork that spoke of its grandiose past. Most residents are pretty easy to care for, Tanya explained, flipping through my orientation packet. Her keys jingled softly as we walked through the winding corridors. Except for Mr. Turner in room 318. He used to be a music teacher at the conservatory downtown. These days, he only sleeps if someone plays the piano in the common room. I nodded, thinking it was a simple enough task. I'd taken piano lessons as a kid. Surely I could manage a few lullabies. The common room itself was beautiful, with floor-to-ceiling windows and dark wood paneling. The grand piano sat in the corner, its polished surface reflecting the last rays of sunlight. Just one thing, Tanya added, her hand resting on the piano's dusty lid. She hesitated, glancing at the darkening sky outside. Whatever you do, don't play after midnight. The previous night nurse. Well, let's just say we have strict rules about that. She didn't elaborate, and I didn't ask. I should have. Looking back, there were signs from the very beginning. The way the other nurses avoided the common room after dark. The way Mr. Turner's file was thicker than the others, filled with incident reports about nocturnal disturbances and musical hallucinations. The way the temperature seemed to drop near the piano, even on warm nights. The first few hours of my shift went smoothly enough. I made my rounds, helped with medications, and checked on the residents. Mrs. Peterson needed her evening tea. Mr. Rodriguez wanted help finding his glasses. They were on top of his head. And Miss Collins told me the same story 3 times about her days as a Broadway dancer. Around 10 p.m., I sat down at the piano to play for Mr. Turner. Simple melodies, nothing fancy. Moonlight Sonata, some Chopin. The kind of peaceful music that helps elderly residents drift off to sleep. As I played, I noticed Mr. Turner standing in the doorway, swaying slightly to the music. His white hair was neatly combed, and despite his advanced age, he carried himself with the posture of a performer. "That's nice," he said softly, "but you're playing it too fast." Elizabeth always knew the proper tempo. His eyes grew distant. Such a talented girl. She had perfect pitch, you know. I slowed the tempo, and Mr. Turner smiled approvingly. He sat in one of the armchairs near the piano, his eyes closed, listening intently. By 11 p.m., soft snores echoed from his chair, and I felt pretty good about myself. Maybe this night shift wouldn't be so bad after all. Then the clock struck midnight. I was at the nurse's station doing paperwork when I heard it, the faintest hint of piano music drifting through the halls. At first, I thought I was imagining things. The building was silent except for the usual nighttime sounds. The hum of fluorescent lights, the distant whir of medical equipment, the occasional creak of settling wood. But there it was again. A melody I didn't recognize, played so softly it was barely audible. The notes were complex, intricate, far beyond my modest abilities. Classical, but with a haunting quality that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I followed the sound to the common room, my footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. The piano sat in darkness, its lid closed, exactly as I'd left it. But the music continued, growing stronger with each step I took toward the instrument. The melody was beautiful but somehow wrong, like a familiar song played in a minor key. That's when I noticed Mr. Turner standing in the doorway of the common room, fully dressed despite the late hour. He wore an old-fashioned suit, complete with a bow tie, as if he were preparing for a recital. His eyes were fixed on the piano, and there was something about his expression that made my blood run cold. "Mr. Turner?" I whispered. "You should be in bed." He didn't look at me. "She's playing my song," he said, his voice trembling. "The one I wrote for her. The piece that was supposed to launch her career." "Who's playing?" "My Elizabeth. She always practices at midnight." His eyes welled with tears. "She was my best student. Such a tragedy. What happened during her final recital?" The music swelled, and I swear I saw the piano keys moving on their own, dancing to a melody that grew more frantic by the second. The temperature in the room plummeted, and my breath came out in visible puffs of air. The chandelier above us began to sway gently, though there wasn't a breeze. Mr. Turner stepped forward, reaching out toward the piano. "I've missed you, Elizabeth," he whispered. "I've waited so long." That's when I saw her, a flickering shape seated at the piano bench, her form transparent but unmistakably that of a young woman in an old-fashioned dress. Her dark hair was pulled back in a tight bun, and her fingers flew across the keys in a blur, the melody building to a crescendo that made the windows rattle. Sheet music began to flutter around the room, pages turning themselves in an invisible wind. I backed away, my heart pounding, but Mr. Turner moved closer, a peaceful smile on his face. "I'm so sorry," he said to the spectral figure. "I should have told them about your heart condition before the performance. I should have known the piece was too demanding." The music stopped abruptly. The ghostly figure turned, and though I could barely make out her features, the sadness in her eyes was unmistakable. She reached out toward Mr. Turner, her form flickering like a candle in the wind. "It wasn't your fault," a voice whispered, echoing as if from a great distance. "I wanted to make you proud." Mr. Turner reached back, his hand passing through hers. "I'm ready for my final lesson now, Elizabeth." The ghost smiled, shifting on the bench to make room. Mr. Turner sat beside her, his movements smooth and sure, unlike his usual fragile demeanor. Together, they began to play, a duet this time, their hands moving in perfect synchronization across the keys. The music was otherworldly, a piece I'd never heard before and would never be able to describe. I should have called for help. I should have tried to stop whatever was happening. Instead, I stood frozen, watching as Mr. Turner and his spectral student played their hearts out, their forms becoming less and less distinct as the music reached its finale. When the last note faded away, both figures were gone. The piano sat silent, its keys untouched, while the first light of dawn began to creep through the windows. That was my last night at Riverside Manor. I submitted my resignation the next morning. They found Mr. Turner in the common room, peaceful in his favorite armchair, a sheet of piano music clutched in his hands. The paper was yellowed with age, its corners crumbling, and at the top was written, "For Elizabeth," in faded ink. The coroner said it was natural causes, but I know better. The story made the local papers. That's how I learned about Elizabeth Chen, a promising young pianist who had collapsed during her graduation recital in 1952. She had been playing an original composition by her teacher, James Turner, when her heart gave out. The piece was never performed again. Sometimes, when I pass by the care home at night, I swear I can still hear piano music drifting through the windows. A teacher and his student, playing duets in the darkness, their melodies eternally entwined in the midnight hour. The music is beautiful now, without the frantic quality it had that night. Just two souls, finally at peace, sharing their love of music forever. I never played piano again, but sometimes, on quiet nights, I find myself humming a fragment of their duet. A melody that doesn't quite belong in this world. A song of regret and forgiveness, of guilt and redemption, of a teacher and student whose music transcended death itself. They say Riverside Manor is still looking for a night nurse. The piano sits untouched in the common room, gathering dust. But every midnight, like clockwork, the music begins again. I never thought I'd find myself working in a library, especially not the imposing Victorian-era building that loomed over the corner of Maple and Fifth. But fresh out of college, with student loans breathing down my neck and rent due in 2 weeks, I couldn't afford to be picky. The job listing had seemed straightforward enough. Night shift cataloging position in rare book section. Independent work environment. Detail-oriented individual required. Competitive salary. What caught my eye was the salary, significantly higher than any other entry-level position I'd seen. Should have known right then that something wasn't quite right. The day of my interview, I arrived early, standing before the heavy wooden doors as the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the stone steps. The building itself seemed to watch me, its Gothic architecture and weathered gargoyles creating an atmosphere that felt more like a cathedral than a library. The brass plaque beside the door read Blackwood Memorial Library, EST 1847 in faded lettering. Inside, the air was thick with the musty scent of old books and furniture polish. The main reading room was impressive, with soaring ceilings and walls lined with dark wooden shelves that stretched up into the shadows. A few elderly patrons sat at the heavy oak tables, but their presence did little to fill the cavernous space. The sound of my footsteps echoed as I approached the circulation desk, where a young woman sat typing at an ancient computer. "I'm here for an interview with Mr. Blackwood," I said quietly, conscious of how my voice carried in the silence. She looked up, and something flickered across her face. Concern? Pity? But it was gone so quickly I thought I must have imagined it. "Of course. Take the stairs to the third floor. Last door on the left." The staircase creaked under my feet as I climbed, the wood worn smooth by decades of use. The third floor was darker than the main level, the windows here smaller and partially covered by heavy velvet curtains. The corridor stretched ahead, lined with closed doors bearing brass nameplates I couldn't quite read in the dim light. Mr. Blackwood's office was exactly where the desk clerk had indicated. The nameplate on his door was different from the others. Older, tarnished almost black except for his name, which gleamed as if recently polished. I knocked, and a soft voice immediately responded, "Enter, Miss Thomas." I hadn't told anyone my name yet. The office was a study in organized chaos. Every surface was covered with books, papers, and curious objects I couldn't identify. Behind a massive mahogany desk sat Mr. Blackwood himself, tall, gaunt, with silver hair and eyes so dark they seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. He didn't stand as I entered, merely gestured to the chair across from him. "Please sit." His voice was barely above a whisper, yet I heard every word clearly. "You're here about the night position." It wasn't a question, but I nodded anyway. "Yes, sir. I saw the listing online and—" He waved his hand dismissively. "Your qualifications are sufficient. The position is yours, should you wish to accept it. The hours are from midnight to 6 a.m., Tuesday through Saturday. You will work alone in the rare books section, cataloging and photographing items according to my specifications. The salary is as advertised, paid weekly. Do you accept?" I blinked, thrown off by the abruptness. "Don't you want to know more about my experience? Or check my references?" A thin smile crossed his face. "I know everything I need to know, Miss Thomas. Do you accept?" Something about his certainty made me uneasy, but the thought of the salary pushed the feeling aside. "Yes, I accept." "Excellent." He opened a drawer and removed a small leather-bound book and a brass key. "This contains your instructions. Memorize them. The key will give you access to the rare books section and your work area. You begin tonight." "Tonight? But I haven't given notice at my other job." "You were fired from the bookstore 3 days ago," he interrupted, that same thin smile playing at his lips. "For tardiness, I believe. This will not be an issue here, will it?" I hadn't told anyone about losing my job. I hadn't even updated my resume yet. "No, sir," I managed to say. "Good. Return here at 11:45 p.m. Miss Chun will show you to your workspace." He turned his attention to a large book on his desk, clearly dismissing me. I left his office in a daze, clutching the instruction book and key. The rational part of my mind was screaming that something was wrong, that I should walk away, but the rest of me was already calculating how many months of rent this job would cover. When I returned that night, the library was dark except for a few security lights. Ms. Chen, the same woman from the circulation desk, was waiting by the front door. She didn't speak as she led me through the building, past the main reading room and down a narrow staircase I hadn't noticed before. The basement level was cooler than the floors above, the air heavy with the scent of old paper and leather. My workspace turned out to be a small room tucked away behind the rare book stacks. A heavy wooden desk dominated the space, its surface bare except for a metal lamp, a camera that looked more antique than digital, and a stack of manila envelopes. The only decoration was a large clock on the wall, its ticking unnaturally loud in the silence. "Your instructions are in the book," Ms. Chun said, speaking for the first time. "Mr. Blackwood is very particular about his procedures." She hesitated, then added, "Don't deviate from them. Not ever." Before I could respond, she turned and left, her footsteps quickly fading away. I sat down and opened the instruction book, its pages yellow with age. The rules were listed in precise handwriting. 1. Each night, you will find a list of books to be photographed on your desk. 2. Locate each book and photograph the specified pages only. 3. Place the photographs in the provided envelope. 4. Do not develop or view the photographs. 5. Leave the envelope in Mr. Blackwood's office before departing. 6. Do not remove any books from the rare books section. 7. Do not attempt to catalog or photograph books not on your list. 8. If you hear anyone in the stacks after hours, do not investigate. 9. If you find any loose pages, do not read them. Place them in the brass box on your desk. 10. Do not remain in the building past 6 a.m. The last rule was underlined 3 times. Sure enough, there was a list on my desk, written in the same handwriting as the instruction book. 5 titles, all in languages I didn't recognize, with specific page numbers listed beside each one. The books weren't hard to find. The rare books section was meticulously organized, each shelf labeled with perfect precision. That first night passed quietly enough. The books were beautiful, bound in leather and decorated with intricate designs. I found myself wanting to read them, to understand the strange symbols and flowing scripts that filled their pages, but I remembered Miss Chin's warning and stuck to my task. The second night, I noticed something odd. One of the books on my list had a familiar name, Thomas. Not just Thomas, but Elizabeth Thomas, my grandmother's name. The book itself was unremarkable, bound in plain brown leather, but seeing my family name sent a chill down my spine. I almost convinced myself it was a coincidence until I saw the publication date, 1847, the same year the library was established. On the third night, I heard footsteps in the stacks. They were slow, deliberate, moving up and down the aisles as if searching for something. I remembered rule number 8 and kept working, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever, or whatever, was out there knew I was listening. The fourth night, I found a loose page on my desk. The paper was old, the edges crumbling, covered in handwriting I recognized from the instruction book. Before I could stop myself, I read the first line. The deal remains in effect. Payment will continue as agreed. I quickly placed it in the brass box, but the words stayed with me. By the end of my first week, I had developed a routine. Arrive at 11:45, check my list, locate the books, photograph the specified pages, deliver the envelope to Mr. Blackwood's office. Simple. Except nothing about this job was simple, and the questions kept piling up. Why did Mr. Blackwood never seem to leave his office? I would see light under his door at midnight, and it would still be there when I left at 6. Why did the list sometimes include books with my family members' names? Why did the camera never need new film, despite taking dozens of photographs each night? The breaking point came during my second week. The list that night contained only one title, a complete record of the Blackwood family, 1847 to 1899. The book was exactly where it should be, bound in black leather with silver clasps. As I opened it to the specified page, a photograph slipped out and fell to the floor. I knew I should put it in the brass box without looking. I knew the rules. But curiosity overcame caution, and I picked it up. The photograph was old, the edges yellow and curling, but the image was crystal clear. It showed the library's reading room, much as it looked today, with a group of people posed formally in front of the circulation desk. The date at the bottom read 1888, and there, in the center of the group, stood Mr. Blackwood. Not someone who looked like him, not an ancestor. It was him, exactly as he appeared today, down to the way he held his left hand slightly curved at his side. Even the suit he wore was the same one I had seen him in that very morning. My hands were shaking as I slipped the photograph into the brass box. When I turned back to the book, I noticed something else. The pages were blank. Every single page, completely empty, as if they had never been written on at all. I heard footsteps in the stacks again, closer this time. Then Mr. Blackwood's voice, soft as ever. "Miss Thomas? A word, please." I ran. Through the stacks, up the stairs, not stopping until I reached my car. As I pulled away from the library, I looked back and saw him standing at the third-floor window, watching me leave. His outline seemed to waver, like heat rising from pavement, And for a moment, just a moment, I could have sworn I saw right through him. My resignation letter was brief. I mailed it the next day, along with the key and instruction book. A week later, I received my final paycheck, along with a note written in that familiar, precise handwriting. Your discretion is appreciated. Some knowledge is not meant to be preserved. I never went back to the library, but sometimes, when I drive past it late at night, I see lights moving in the basement windows. And sometimes, just sometimes, I catch a glimpse of a tall figure standing at the third-floor window, as if waiting for someone to return the books I was never meant to find. Last month, I received a job offer in the mail. The salary was incredible, the hours perfect. The letterhead read, Blackwood Digital Archives, preserving history since 1847. I burned it without reading past the first line. Some jobs aren't worth any salary. Some questions are better left unanswered. And some libraries, I've learned, collect far more than just books. I should have known something was off about the job from the start. The pay was too good for basic overnight security work at a tech company, and the hiring process was suspiciously quick. One phone interview, no background check, and I was starting that night. But when you're 3 months behind on rent and desperate, you don't ask too many questions. Axiom Technologies occupied the entire 8th floor of a downtown high-rise. My shift supervisor, Miranda, gave me a rush tour just before sunset. It's pretty straightforward, she explained. Walking briskly through the maze of cubicles and conference rooms, monitor the security feeds, do hourly walks around the floor, and log anything unusual. The other guard, Keith, handles floors 6 and 7. The security office was a small room near the elevator bank, walls lined with monitors showing different areas of the floor. A desk with 2 chairs faced the screens, and a mini fridge hummed quietly in the corner. Keith will show you the ropes, Miranda said, checking her watch. He should be here any minute. Don't leave the floor unless there's an emergency, and always keep your radio on. She handed me a key card and a walkie-talkie before hurrying toward the elevator. What about bathroom breaks? I called after her. Use the one down the hall. And Haley? She held the elevator door open for a moment. If Keith starts acting strange, just ignore him. He's been here a long time. The doors closed before I could ask what she meant. I spent the next 20 minutes familiarizing myself with the monitor setup. Each screen showed a different section of the floor, cubicles, break rooms, conference areas, and corridors. The night shift was from 8 p.m. to 6 a.m., and by the time the clock hit 8:15, Keith still hadn't shown up. At 8:30, I decided to do my first walkthrough. The floor was eerily quiet, the only sound coming from the gentle hum of computers left running overnight. Motion-activated lights flickered on as I walked, creating pools of fluorescent brightness in the otherwise dim space. I was checking the last conference room when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned to find a tall man standing in the doorway, his security uniform slightly too small for his frame. He had to be in his 50s, with thinning gray hair and thick glasses that magnified his pale blue eyes. "You must be Haley," he said, his voice unexpectedly high-pitched. "I'm Keith." He didn't offer to shake hands, just stood there staring at me with an unsettling intensity. "Nice to meet you," I replied, trying to sound casual. "Miranda said you'd show me around? Follow me." He turned abruptly and started walking, not checking to see if I was following. Back in the security office, Keith sat down at the desk without a word and began adjusting the monitors. I noticed his movements were oddly precise, almost mechanical. "The cameras run on a 30-second delay," he explained, not looking at me. "Sometimes they show things that aren't there anymore. Sometimes they show things that never were." I wasn't sure how to respond to that. Okay. What should I be watching for? Movement. He finally turned to look at me, his eyes seeming even larger behind his glasses. "Any movement at all. Log it in here." He tapped a thick notebook on the desk. Time, location, description, everything. I glanced at the notebook. The previous entries were written in cramped, obsessive handwriting. 10:15 p.m., movement in cubicle B7. Computer screen flickered. 11:42 p.m., shadow past conference room 3. No source found. 1:17 a.m., figure standing in break room. gone when investigated. These entries, I started to say, are all accurate, Keith interrupted. Every single one. His fingers drummed against the desk in an odd rhythm. You'll see. The next few hours were uncomfortable, to say the least. Keith barely moved, his eyes fixed on the monitors. Every now and then, he'd write something in the notebook, his pen scratching against the paper. I tried making small talk, but his responses were either one-word answers or bizarre non-sequiturs about the building's history. Around midnight, I noticed something odd on one of the screens. A shadow seemed to move across an empty corridor, but when I looked at the adjacent cameras, there was nothing there. Did you see that? I asked. Keith smiled for the first time, but it didn't reach his eyes. Movement. Log it. But what was it? Log it, he repeated, more firmly this time. I wrote down the incident, feeling ridiculous. It was probably just a trick of the light, or maybe the camera glitching. But over the next few hours, I saw more inexplicable things. Chairs that seemed to move slightly between camera sweeps. Shadows that shouldn't exist given the lighting. And once, just for a split second, what looked like a figure standing in the break room, though the door had been locked all night. Keith recorded everything without comment, his writing getting progressively more frantic with each entry. I noticed he kept glancing at me when he thought I wasn't looking, that same intense stare that made my skin crawl. At 3 a.m., he stood up suddenly. Time for rounds, he announced. You stay here. I watched him on the monitors as he walked through the floor, his movements still unnaturally precise. He stopped in each room, standing completely still for exactly 30 seconds before moving on. When he reached the break room, he spent several minutes staring directly into the camera. When he returned, something about him seemed different. His movements were jerkier, his breathing more labored. Your turn, he said. Check everything. Every room, every corner. Shouldn't one of us stay with the monitors? Go. His voice had changed too, becoming even higher and more strained. Now, I didn't want to go, but I also didn't want to stay alone with him in that small room. The floor felt different now, more threatening somehow. The lights seemed dimmer, the shadows deeper. In each room, I could swear I heard footsteps behind me, but every time I turned around, there was nothing there. In the break room, all the chairs had been arranged in a circle, facing the center. I was certain they hadn't been like that during my first round. My radio crackled to life, making me jump. See anything interesting? Keith's voice was distorted by static. No, I lied. Everything's normal. Check the supply closet next to conference room 4, he said. I thought I saw movement there. The supply closet was at the far end of the floor, away from the security office. Every instinct told me not to go, but I could see Keith watching me through the cameras. Slowly, I made my way there. The closet door was slightly ajar, a thin line of darkness visible through the gap. As I reached for the handle, I heard Keith's voice again, this time not through the radio but right behind me. Find anything yet? I spun around, heart racing, but the corridor was empty. My radio crackled again. Haley, are you there? Keith's voice came through the speaker. But if he was in the security office, how had I just heard him behind me? I ran, not toward the security office, but toward the emergency stairs. Behind me, I heard footsteps, too many footsteps, moving at that same mechanical pace. I didn't look back. The stairwell door slammed shut behind me with a bang that echoed up and down the concrete shaft. I took the stairs 2 at a time, the fluorescent lights flickering with each floor I passed. Above me, a door opened and closed. Below me, another one did the same. When I reached the lobby, I burst through the door and nearly collided with the night receptionist. Are you okay? She asked, looking concerned. I couldn't speak, just shook my head and headed for the main entrance. Behind me, I heard the elevator ding. I didn't turn around to see if it was Keith. The next morning, I called Miranda to quit. Before I could explain, she cut me off. Keith already told me you left early. Don't worry about it. This happens sometimes. The job isn't for everyone. But Keith, there was something wrong with him. She sighed. Keith hasn't worked here for 3 years, Haley. He had an accident in the supply closet. Heart attack, they said. The new guy, Tom, has been covering his shifts, but I spent hours with him last night. No, she said quietly. You were alone up there. Check the security footage if you don't believe me. I didn't check the footage. I didn't want to know what I'd see, or wouldn't see. But sometimes, when I pass that building at night, I look up at the 8th floor. Sometimes I see movement in the windows, a tall figure going room to room in precise, mechanical movements. And sometimes, just sometimes, I swear I can hear a high-pitched voice carried on the wind, still logging every unexplained shadow, every mysterious movement, every figure that isn't quite there. I found another security job eventually, day shift only. The pay isn't as good, but at least I know my coworkers are breathing. Most of them, anyway. Yesterday, a new guard started, an older man with thick glasses who moves with oddly precise movements. I put in my 2 weeks' notice this morning. Some jobs aren't worth any amount of money. Some things you're not meant to see. And some shifts, once they start, never really end. If this first day on the job horror story sent shivers down your spine, don't forget to smash that like button and hit subscribe for more terrifying workplace tales from the night shift. Ring that notification bell to make sure you never miss another spine-chilling story of what lurks in empty office buildings after dark. Which would creep you out more? Finding out your coworker died years ago, or seeing yourself on the security cameras when you're alone in the building? Let me know in the comments below, and share your own workplace horror stories. I read every comment and love hearing what keeps you up at night. Stay safe out there, and remember, if something feels wrong on your first day, maybe there's a reason your body is telling you to run. Trust those instincts. They might just save your life. Thanks for joining me for another nightmare. Sleep tight, if you can, and I'll see you in the next terrifying tale. Sweet dreams, while they last.